The title of this session is Artist's Voice, History's Claim. What we're going to do is we are each going to make a presentation, and then we're going to have a very brief discussion among ourselves. We don't know what each of the other is presenting. And then we'll open it to the audience at large. This is a very distinguished panel, of which I am honored to be the moderator, who have collectively mounted memorable exhibitions. They've written engaging and challenging texts, and they've accomplished innovative treatments propelled by a thoughtful assessment of complex issues. They are Lynne Cooke, to my far left, who's been curator at the Dia Art Foundation in New York since 1991. Wharton, who's a conservator specializing in time-based media at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He's also a research scholar at New York University with a joint appointment at the Institute of Fine Arts Conservation and Museum Studies program. Wagner is professor of modern and contemporary art at University of California, Berkeley. Garrels, to my right, is deputy director, exhibitions and public programs, and chief curator at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. And Laurenson, as you know, is head of time-based media conservation at the Tate Gallery, London. In preparation for this discussion today, I wrote the following to each of the panelists in an email. I wrote, I'm interested in our debating the issues surrounding instances wherein an artist requested or expected changes, alterations, treatments of his or her work that in your mind countered our professional responsibility to history to preserve or record an initial appearance or presentation. In fact, you may not agree that we have that responsibility. To approach the question, we would present problematic instances and our attempts at resolution. The intent is to open for discussion a topic that engaged conservators, art historians, and curators inevitably encounter in the course of their work. In other words, what encounters with objects and artists moved your thinking forward? As we think forward, we must not overlook precedent, however. History may or may not be our guide. For those of us who began our careers treating and considering old master painting and sculpture, we will remember our dogged commitment to identifying what was original and preserving it at all costs. Repaints were removed, pastiches were undone, enormous effort was put into reassembling on paper, if not in fact, elements of works of art that had been dispersed or otherwise changed from the original. We did all this in the name of history and in the name of the artist. Now, in the name of the artist, we may be doing something very different. Why? What has changed? Has anything changed, or are we simply following the custom of voicing concerns by people we know? Art in our own time, which is somehow charged differently from art of another time. Maybe our attitudes are the same as those of people writing or conserving art of their own time, no matter which century they lived in. Maybe not. With these unresolved thoughts in mind, I chose to entitle the panel Artist's Voice, History's Claim. And as I said, each panelist will present one instance of something that came up in the course of their careers that was problematic and present the facts, and then after we will discuss them. All right, we're going to start with Lynne.
Thanks, Carol. The subject of my talk and the subject that I'm still in the midst of this issue, so it's not as if I have a resolved position on it. So I thought it might be a good subject to address. And it's one single work by the German artist Imi Knoebel called and I'll use English titles throughout this, 24 Colors for Blinky. It was made in 1977 when Knoebel had recently learned that his closest friend, the painter Blinky Palermo, had died, and Knoebel made this painting, which is in 24, it has 24 elements but 21 parts, in that 3 of them overlap to make one component. And it was shown later that same year, 1977, at the Heine Friedrich Gallery in Cologne, and these are 2 of the installation shots, and you see the one that's made up of 3 elements leaning together, also from the same gallery installation. After that, the following year, it entered Deer's collection. Deer was a private foundation at that moment, and it went into storage, where it stayed for more or less 30 years. A few years ago, when conservators went to look at some of the works Deer has of Knoebel's still in storage in Germany, discovered that the work had been damaged quite severely in some cases. And this was partly because the storage company had changed location. They'd been bought by another storage company, and there was really a terrible history. So the question was what to do with it, how to restore it, should we write it off? And I began a conversation with Knoebel, who said that he didn't want it restored, but rather he would remake it. So after some time, he had an exhibition coming up in Weimar in 2005 in a rather small room, but he thought that he would remake some of these components as the beginning of the whole restoration process. And he did. He made 9 of them and installed them there. After that show was down and those works returned to his studio, I resumed the conversation with him about getting on with the other 14 or so missing ones. And he said that he'd come to the conclusion that he didn't want to finish out the series, but he wanted to start again and remake the whole lot all over again. And his reason, most pressing reason for him was that he realized that in remaking them, and he didn't just repaint the surface, he rebuilt the whole wooden chassis and the wooden support, that the way he built it the second time, the pieces of wood were abutted, and that he thought over a long, long time these might come out of alignment and you'd have lines breaking the monochrome surface. And so he had thought of another way of joining them with a more like a tongue and groove system, which he thought would preempt that happening. And so he agreed. And so he's embarked on this third stage of creating these works. When Palermo made this piece, it was the first time he'd used colour. He felt that Palermo, who'd been such a great colourist, had given him his colours on his death, and that instead of working with just masonite or white or black, he now had permission to introduce colour. And the reason for the 24 was 24 or so many you couldn't remember. It could be all colour, and there was no system in the choice of colour, just as there's no system in the shapes. They're free shapes and therefore encompass everything in a way. And so for him, this piece, a term he has used for it is it has a repertoire. In talking about what Knoebel means, there's very little to go on in that he's famously reticent, and to my knowledge there are only 2 interviews he's ever published in his life, both with Johannes Sturtgen, who was a critic who joined the Dusseldorf Academy during the years that Palermo was a student there, so someone Knoebel was close to. You might ask, why would we agree to do this? It seems a fairly extreme response to take, and perhaps the first answer might be because the artist wants it, and in a way Deer has always worked closely with artists and therefore would be inclined to be receptive to that argument. I think, to be perfectly honest, we couldn't have got very far without his cooperation. Even if we restored it, since it's never been shown again, there are practically no records. We would have very little to go on in trying to find a way to display it without his goodwill and interest. And so it behooved us, I think, to get his involvement as much as possible. Another reason, I think it's an important one, is that there's a precedent for him remaking works. When he had a retrospective in Eindhoven in 1985, he remade all the early pieces, which were similar to this, but in black and white, and they were simply double dated. The fourth one, and for me, the one that really, in retrospect, seems the most powerful, I think, is to think about how this work fits in within his practice at that moment. As I said, he thinks of it as a repertoire, as having this potential, and he can take components from it. It doesn't have to all be shown as an entity, as you see in the Weimar example, and it stands for all colors and, in a sense, all shapes. He also pointed out that it was only after making this painting that he made another painting called Red, Blue, and Yellow, which he sees as his foundational painting. It's reductive. It has, for him, the three basic colors. So this is somehow preliminary to that. And I think it's that in part, and it's also because there's one other piece that you might say is also a repertoire that preceded it but is very important in his oeuvre, and that's a piece called Room 19 from 1968, which is also in Dia's collection, and you see two different installation views of it. It's made up of 77 components, many of them that relate to paintings, to the stretcher, to the rectilinear format, to elemental shapes that might appear in paintings. At this stage, Knoebel had not painted any paintings, and the way the piece is installed is provisional. He installed it in this case. In another case, he said the crew who are unpacking it can simply put the elements down as they like. There's a plan to have a young artist who's very interested in Knoebel. She will arrange it at Dia another time. So it has this open-ended quality, and it's been remade because in the 90s, when he wanted to show it in an exhibition, it was in New York, and he felt it was too expensive to ship it back to Europe, so he made another version and added more. So there's this sense at this moment within his practice that the provisional and in some ways the fugitive almost, is part of his thinking, as is the idea of repertoire. As I said, he felt he had not used colour before, but there is one instance of him using a colour prior to the 24 colours, and that is when, following Palermo's example, he painted a painting with an orange underpaint that's used for preventing rust. It's something that's known, the Palermo paintings exist. But what Knoebel liked about this material, which he calls minium, particularly, was that when you first paint it and it dries, it's apparently bright orange, but over time it fades, and so it has to be made again. And I think, and then in addition, there was a white painting that he'd made, which was on board like these with a neutral monochrome white surface, and it had some subsequent manifestations, one of which it simply turned into a plain light projection with nothing material, and that in turn turned into simply marks and measurements on the wall. So looking at all of these instances of what preceded this and thinking about, by deduction, not through talking to him analytically about his practice at the time, but looking at these as cases, it seemed to me that this gave the 24 colours a certain kind of identity, which meant that having another version or yet another version really didn't matter. It's a conclusion I don't think I would have come to when I first began this, but over time, that's where I've got.
Great. Thank you. Clear. Pip, I think you're next, so pass down the...
Okay, I want to challenge some of the assumptions of Carol's sort of opening gambit to us in a way, particularly the idea of the initial appearance or presentation, and that the idea that we as conservators are working back to that. So I hope that this will be useful to the discussion. So Paul McCarthy yesterday spoke of the difficulty of knowing when something was finished. And I think many of us working with artist installations and time-based works are aware that often when the work goes on display, it may be the first or only maybe the third time that the artist has had a chance to see the space, the equipment and everything all assembled. And, different works are going to take different amounts of time to settle down, and there's definitely a period with works where things are still shifting and settling. This is an image of a piece by Carlos Garrels, which Tate bought at the Miami Art Fair, where there was a very long period of time where the artist worked very closely with conservation in order to really sort of define its museum form. There's also a group of works where the notion of initial appearance doesn't seem to hold any specific special weight. These artists often stay very involved with their works, and as a result, the appearance will change in the course of the life of the work and, of course, the life of the artist. As conservators, our job is to record those moments and perhaps also try to deliver the work in any of those configurations to future curators who may be interested in the work at that particular historical moment in time. That's another Garrels image. Sorry, these aren't the best order. I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 images of a work by Susan Hiller called Belshazzar's Feast. This is an image from 1983. I think this is the ICA. And then this is a slightly later image. This is one from 80... I think this was actually, about 86, this one. And you can see how it's changed. This is unfortunately a black and white image, but the photograph is actually embedded in the wall. We haven't got a sofa. The wallpaper's still there, and the images are on the wall, but it's a very different configuration. And this is how it was shown at Tate Britain in 2002. So just to show some examples of the way in which works will evolve. Some artists... like Sildo Morales, I'm going to have to go back, the very idea of a finished work is somewhat anathema to his process. I think he valiantly works with the museum, and he's very appreciative of the problem-solving skills of the conservation department, but you can see it's often not comfortable for him to work within the logic that assumes that we're moving towards something fixed and finished. And I think working and talking to him really brought about this idea that artists are working with very different sorts of models and paradigms from perhaps the traditional one we inherit from conservation. So just to move on. So I think it is important for conservation to be responsive to different sorts of working practices rather than try and fit all works into one particular and actually rather rare model where the artist finishes the work in their studio, delivers it to the gallery, who sells it to the museum, who hangs it on the wall. We don't see very many works that are really like that in my area. Anyway, however, it is important that we understand what territory we're in from the outset. Now, what I did want to talk about is works where there's a radical disconnect between prehistory of the work and its museum form, and a second date is given. For example, we're looking here at Gustav Metzger's Liquid Crystal Environment. So this was originally a performance which formed a backdrop to the likes of The Who and The Cream in the mid-1960s. The installation form of the work was only brought into being in 2005, and it was done with the involvement of the artist and the wonderful technical facilitator Adrian Fogarty. But I think it's an interesting example of a sort of segue into the whole issue of prehistory of many of our museum works. Of course, many museum works of art, historical and contemporary, have a very different life before they came into the museum. With contemporary, they may have been part of a performance or commissioned for a specific site or part of a biennial. And historically, of course, we only need to consider the predella panels in our museums to know that these prehistories aren't new. But what is the contemporary equivalent to the predella? And perhaps it's the 8mm film transferred to DVD, which is editioned for sale 30 years after its inception. Is that similar to a predella panel? What, of course, makes this different is that we're talking only 30 years, and the decisions are being made by the artist and their galleries are not the ravages of time. Of course, I think the market has perhaps always been involved in these sorts of decisions. But with the greater issue of interest in works of the late 60s and early 70s, they are increasingly being repackaged for sale. And of course, when they were made, they really had no market value. Now, I'm not being particularly judgmental about this. I'm actually really unclear what the museum's responsibility is to the prehistory with regard to these sorts of works. And there's an example here by Cindy Sherman called Doll Clothes, which was made while, I think it was a college piece and has recently been packaged for sale. So this is a very real issue. So I think the question I just want to pose is, given our fine art context, do we have a responsibility to future historically accurate display of these works?
Thank you. Okay.
I just have one slide. Well, I feel myself to be somewhat the odd person out because I have to confess my interaction with contemporary artists have been few and far between, and I've never really been in the decision of actually having to decide anything about the display of a work or its sort of historic form. It's just kind of outside my line of work, except if we consider the writing of criticism and history to involve decisions and representations that give work historical form. If we make that leap, then I can't stand on the side of the room entirely. And in thinking about that issue and thinking about what kinds of encounters my career has allowed, which have asked me to think about the forms that works do take and how those forms might be in conflict with the forms that they might be imagined or might be assigned when they enter the sort of historical space of the museum, took me to early work on Eva Hesse and reminded me of my very early visits to Oberlin, where Hesse's estate is now, as many of you in the audience know, indeed far better than I. And I remember coming across the set of black and white photographs which are displayed on the left, and they're displayed in an arrangement which has nothing to do with Hesse's arrangement. They're 4 distinct photographs, but they were photographed as I asked them to be photographed, for them to be photographed by the museum. And this is the result that was sent to me. What they represent are studies in plaster that Hesse did for a work that was to become Repetition 19 in its various versions. And my mind went back, and you see one of its versions, the MoMA version, in this image on the right. And the reason that my mind went back to these images was because it forced me to think about the interruption that death and museumification often impose on artworks, and the kinds of potential play concerning rearrangement, concerning placement, which were clearly part of Hesse's mind as she photographed her studies, which eventually become obscured as the work circulates historically. The image on the right is the historical form that I use to teach with. It's my best image of Repetition 19.2, and it is a Saskia slide, and it's a great improvement, moreover, on the illustration of the work which is in the Barrett catalog, because you can see into them, you can understand that they are buckets. But what you can't see, and what concerns me, is their instability as objects and the ways in which that fact of their movability, their potential to be reinstalled, is always offered as a kind of supplement to the historical form that the work takes. These are issues, I think, which came up in what Nancy Troy had to say earlier today. And they also have just come up in what Pip had to say about the prehistory of the work. I've made a note of that term in quotes, and in line with my desire to collaborate with Pip on all things, I will adopt her work and have my question be about the relationship between the prehistory of the work and the forms that it takes in its representations, including those representations which occur in the museum space, for which, as I say, I have never had any direct responsibility.
Lynne?
Next.
Next.
Okay. Actually, I just have one image as well, and this is it. Namjoon Paik, Untitled, 1993, in the collection of MoMA. Let me give you a little bit of background, or at least my general interest, which I think is continuing the theme of artist voice in the historical context. Since I began my position at MoMA, I've been very interested in the relationships that artists have with the museum, and particularly individual relationships with curatorial departments, and how these come into play when older works in the collection are reinstalled. In particular, I'm interested in the artist's role in the reinstallation process and the extent to which the artist is interested in being involved and is accepted in being involved. And I can say at MoMA, the artists in general are very involved in reinstalling the media installations. So in that context, this piece was acquired in 1994, 1 year after it was completed by the artist. Finished. It consists of a player piano, which he modified. He installed the player components. So it plays show tunes on floppy disks. There are 15 CRT monitors piled up and around the television that are run on 4 different channels. 2 of the channels just show live feed from live feed cameras mounted on the piano. One of the piano keys playing as the music, the show tunes play, and the other of the hammers going back and forth. The other monitors show moving images of the artist's hands when he was playing the piano, and John Cage as well, and Merce Cunningham. So it's a very busy, very noisy piece, but I want to direct your attention to the Laserdisc players on the floor on the left and right side of the piano. And my thinking, my concern about this is sort of a one-liner, but it, to me, invokes a lot of deeper questions about this particular artist and this particular piece and the larger question of artist's role. It was originally acquired on U-matic tapes. These are the moving images. And for the 1994 installation, they were migrated to Laserdisc. So when it was first shown at MoMA in 1994, they were shown on Laserdisc. We're now debating how to migrate to new technologies. We'll probably show it on DVDs in the future and migrate the Laserdisc to different kind of master technologies. Question is, now that the artist is no longer with us to be involved in the reinstallations, do we continue displaying the Laserdisc players, or do we display the DVD players? In which case, if we were to display the Laserdisc players, would we put the active DVD players behind the wall so that they're not visible to the public? And as most of you probably know, Namjoon Paik was very involved with installations and also very stand back at the same time. He liked the idea of chance and curatorial discretion and allowing other people to make decisions about how the piece should look. He also loved technology upgrades. And I have no doubt that he would have wanted us to play it on DVD players with that visible. But he didn't leave any specific instructions. We did interview his curator, John Huffman, who suggested putting the DVD players behind the wall and showing the Laserdisc players. One of the curators at MoMA feels that this would be dishonest. So we're discussing this right now, and we will eventually make a decision, but we're putting all topics on the table for discussion. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Good. I thought that was a good ending.
Okay. I was just about to give you my own personal take, but maybe I won't.
All right,
I'd
we'll
rather
come to
not.
that. We'll come to that in a minute. Okay?
I have one slide,
Oh.
or two, maybe I have four, actually, I think. Different views of the same kind of thing. No? Somebody else? There we go. Back to Saul LeWitt. I organized a retrospective with Saul that was shown at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And yes, alas, we couldn't borrow the Oberlin piece. But it was, this is a view of the first gallery, which focused on the open cube structures from the mid-60s, sort of the classic minimal structures of Saul's. And you'll see the piece in the middle is, in fact, the only piece that Saul, at least to my knowledge, ever completely remade. It was a piece done in 1966. It was shown at the Primary Structures Show at the Jewish Museum. It's kind of an absolutely iconic piece. And somewhere along the way, it was lost or destroyed. It was refabricated in 1969 and then refabricated again in 1999. And so it was an absolutely brilliant, pristine, white, open cube. And Saul liked pristine white. He had absolutely no interest in patina. You know, this came up this morning. You know, exactly the opposite. You know, to get rid of any idea of the materiality of the structure or of the surface. And but we borrowed pieces from various museum and private collections, and maybe this. I think this is about and discovered they all had slightly different tones of white, and some of them were one from the Art Institute in Chicago had been bought very soon after it was first made and was kept in impeccable, beautiful condition, but the white definitely had a creaminess to it. There was another piece you can see on the sidewall there that was in a private collection that Saul had completely repainted, and it was very beautiful. But anyway, everyone was actually different, and you realize, and here I would have advocated probably the radical solution, which we couldn't do because we didn't own these pieces, but I would have liked to have seen them all repainted so that they would have been perfect white, as dematerialized as possible, which was the way Saul had really envisioned them at the time they were made. Because Saul, he had no interest. The other thing is, though, he did not have objects remade. As I said, the structure in the middle, as far as I know, is the only one remade. So he kept the structure. He could have remade structures, but he never did, but did advocate having them perfectly painted so they're absolutely pristine and white and without surface indications. And because he had no interest in them really as physical objects. They're really situations. They're efflorescences of an idea that allow you to understand space and time and your own body and your own sense of perception through a kind of lens that's provided by this object. But the object itself actually has, very little importance, except as this mechanism. So that the idea of fetishizing the object and dealing with it in its, its history, or where you have the original paint, but probably isn't the color that it was at the time it was first made. For me, I found it actually, and it was only when I actually saw all these things together in the room that it became so pronounced. I could see in my mind's eye what the experience would have been at the time it was done. Of course, I was not, didn't see these things at that time. But I have to say, in my mind's eye, I still would love someday to see a perfect kind of reiteration of what Saul would have done at the time. So you see it in the way it was first conceived by the artist. So I have to say, can't remember any time where I've had to actually, and I've worked with lots and lots and lots of artists, and some of them a little complicated, but I can't remember actually any time where I've actually had to override an artist where I felt like a piece would have been compromised in some way through an intrusion. But I have to say, I think also it's very clear, and I think most curators would agree with this, that you basically don't want the artist to rework the piece, because it always turns, not always, but it pretty much turns into another piece if they themselves do it. Saul also would have his pieces sent back to be repainted by the assistant who had painted most of them originally, so that they were being re-executed by the person who had done them initially.
Okay, we have an enormous and good series of issues. I'd like the house lights to be up, because you're all going to be involved in this discussion as well. We have as many informed voices out there as here, in fact, many more. So I'm expecting everyone to participate. We have some very clear differences of opinion. Some may be, or not differences of opinion, different ways maybe of looking at works of art. We've heard about artists who have no interest in the physical object. Saul seems to be the name that keeps coming up, but others we've heard about. And yet we've also heard a thought that the artist's voice is in the art itself, the object. So that's obviously two poles of thinking about this art and this kind of art. One of the big things we have to talk about is what about when the artist is alive? And would you do the same thing if the artist were dead? And what are those criteria that you then use? So I'm going to ask, the panel can ask each other's questions, but I, of course, will start because I'm going to start. And Pip, I'm going to start with you. Because we were talking about working with living artists, things constantly changing, it's pre-purchase history and changing. What happens when the artist is dead? How do the criteria change, and how do you document them in anticipation of that?
Well, I have to say the collection I work with, I have predominantly living artists, and we've only lost a few of them. So, but I think that because, the nature of an installation is that it's this installed event, and so I think we're very used to documenting each of those events and the conditions that maybe bring about change. I also work with a collection that is the part of the collection which is very dependent on technology, so we are constantly dealing with forces of change in all their forms. So I think for me the most important thing is that I understand the identity of the work and what it is I'm trying to preserve. That's the work I need to do while the artist is still alive. And really be mindful of that in terms of my response with them. So if I'm working with an artist who it's very clear from the outset that this work is going to have a life that they will be involved in and it will change, then my feeling is that we have a really frank discussion about what happens at the point where they lose interest or die, And I think that by building precedent, I think that we can then work with the curators in terms of what their interest is when we come to install the work in the future. So, I mean, that is the process that I think we're engaged in on a day-to-day basis with these artists. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And it harkens back to what Lynne was saying in terms of precedent. you look into the artist's work and decisions that he or she made along the way that might direct that.
And I think that speaks, Anne, you said earlier, don't always believe what artists say. It's another piece of evidence that has to be scrutinized. And I think what artists have done provides a context for reading or reinterpreting what they're saying now, and that the past histories around a work will tell you a great deal more. But I also wanted to pick up on something, I think it was Andrew who asked this question about why do we all have this terrible wrenching thing about Mondrian and much less visceral reaction to the Lewitt issues. And I think there's something about painting. And it may be that painting normally or conventionally encodes touch, but I think there's something erratic about painting as an art form that's different for many of us from other art forms. And so I was interested, the Knoebel case is interesting to me, particularly because we don't destroy and remake paintings with impunity. I think we would remake a Naumann neon much more easily than we would think about the question of destroying painting. And something in this that I think has come up again and again over the course of the day, and maybe speaks to what Gary was saying about, he'd like to see all the white Lewitt structures repainted. It doesn't, you might disagree, but it doesn't seem a heretical idea in some senses to me.
But now it's too late. I wish I had sort of pushed it further earlier, and put together a room with Saul of pieces from private collections where you got everybody to agree that they should be repainted. And that would have been perfect, but now I can't do that, so we missed that boat. Can I bring up about repainting?
Yeah.
Everybody knows Rauschenberg's, I'm sure, the 1951 white paintings, which, they were lost or whatever. And they were repainted for a show in 1968. Bryce Martin repainted those, or remade them under Rauschenberg's supervision. And those paintings now, of course, this is a question that I haven't followed up on. I actually acquired one of these for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and I always thought this was something to follow up with Bob. But my sense is that Bob probably would just like to keep them as fresh as possible. But on the other hand, there is now a somewhat erratic quality, for me particularly, because they were painted for a particular exhibition in 1968 by Bryce Martin. So there is a kind of fetishistic quality, but I am almost positive that Rauschenberg would just like to see them just quite pristine as possible. And so it brings up a different issue about this idea of touch and intention, and in Mondrian's work, at least part for me, and maybe this goes to somebody like Bob Ryman, where the quality of the making of the painting is so intrinsic to the ultimate experience of the work, rather than the kind of conceptualization of the work as an object. It takes on its meaning and its value through the process of its own making. And maybe that's also in an artist like Hesse, where that's so intrinsic to the work. And I think that's a different thing, whereas someone like Lewitt, the process of the making doesn't really enter into the end condition or experience of the work.
I think that's absolutely right. It's two completely different categories of work. But I'd like to turn this question to people in the audience who work primarily on old master paintings. I'm looking in the direction over there. This idea of Martin repainting a Rauschenberg is certainly not new in the history of art. Can we have a comment from the floor? David, are you? All right.
Certainly the old master perspective is a very telling one, but I want to address this in the panel tomorrow, so I don't want to use up all my gunpowder today. But I think the idea of an artist actually specifying as Rauschenberg did, the repainting of a picture every time it's exhibited, is something that is quite alien to the old master concept. And we're talking an utterly different history and philosophy of conservation here. And I think that the perspectives we're examining in these 2 days are so different from the philosophies of conservation that I'm used to, that this is not really a sort of parallel universe, but one that's disconnected. And I'm intrigued and fascinated by it. And I'd love to talk more about this at the end of the day tomorrow,
All right,
when we've had more discussions.
There's a hand behind you.
Thank you. This just recalls for me a first experience at the Guggenheim Museum working on an exhibition of an artist who was a Mondrian follower, so Ilya Balatovsky, who had made a mural in the 1930s that had been painted over. And he wanted it very much to be in his retrospective, and he offered to repaint it, and the museum said, no, you can't. So I just sort of turned this around a little bit, and I do think this is relevant to the old master thing. But so is it about a certain kind of character of contemporary, these issues where reproducibility and industrial materials and mass production and mass audiences and so on is so embedded in these things that it really does, it's part of how you think about the possibilities of what can happen in the conservation studio or in the way of remaking something that you just can't allow an artist to, as it were, preceded that. So the role of the museum in those situations, or of conservators and curators, are so different.
I think what I'd like to say to this and then turn to the panel is I've worked in museums where the idea of turning a work of art back to the artist to rework is problematic, because the artist is often working in a different style or working in a different material, and the artist's desire to create the work is very different from a conservator's dictate to preserve what is original and try to retain the original materiality and feeling. And so you run a risk. A risk is not the right word. You run the possibility, because I'm not sure it is a risk, but it's a possibility of an artist reworking something. And so a museum that might feel a sense of history, of having to keep what was original, would be not inclined to do that. It's different when we're talking about, perhaps, material, something that the artist's hand was never on to begin with. And maybe that's some of what we're talking about when it gets into industry materials.
Yeah, if I could just return to the old master context for a moment. Many in this audience will be aware of the story of Edgar Degas, who used to visit his friends' homes who owned pictures by him, especially Henri Rouart, his great friend. And he would go there for dinner, and he would just say, I was never quite happy with that painting. Do you mind if I just borrow it back? And of course he would, with his failing eyesight, he would ruin it. It was, of course, one of the great legends of Henri Rouart's relationship with Degas that eventually Rouart padlocked his pictures to the wall so that Degas couldn't remove them. But there's a postscript to this, because I was actually trained in London by a restorer called Helmut Ruhrmann, and when I was working with him, he was actually given to restore a painting by Degas that had been reworked in exactly this way. Mm-hmm. It was a very beautiful early racecourse scene that had been repainted later in life by Degas himself in a sort of muddy, messy reworking. And the private owner asked Ruhrmann to take off the later Degas painting, which Ruhrmann did. Now, what the ethics of that are, I simply can't begin to speculate on, but in that case, the restorer took off the artist's later reworking and returned it to an earlier state. And I think that has interesting resonances for some of the things we're talking about today.
No, it's absolutely central, and that's why I'm glad we've gone in this direction, because some of these problems that we're debating about a work of art never being finished, the artist always wishing to go back into it, it's pre-purchase history, and then it's after. I mean, this has been going on as long as artists make art. And so these issues are something that I think are helpful in seeing, perhaps, broadened in a larger picture. How about panelists first, please, and then there.
Well, I just wanted to embroider a little bit on Lynne's pointing us to the specialness of painting, and remind us that as long as we consider painting to be an autograph activity, then the kinds of recurring questions that are being debated here will recur. I don't think that anybody really blinked very suspiciously when Richard Serra remade his splashing piece at SF MoMA. This is a piece which derives directly from Pollock's kinds of practice, but because the accidental qualities of the autograph production seemed to matter so much, it was an artist's reworking that was absolutely tolerated. But the counterfactual that maybe some of you, or the potential issue that some of you may know more about, might come out of the case of what would it be like to remake a painting that was assigned to an author, that is, done by Warhol, but where we know that Warhol didn't do all his paintings. I mean, that seems to raise some really knotty problems where nothing about all the meanings we assign to Warhol's work actually do concern his manipulation of media without any question. That's what his work is about. But they are not, those manipulations don't concern autographic touch. And that's really, really interesting
that's
to me.
Not true.
I disagree too.
Yeah.
I have just joined the Warhol Authentication Board. I've just had my first meeting, and it was so absolutely amazing to see an array of works through the course of a day, and I've always felt this anyway, that Warhol actually did have a very, very, very distinct touch and a very distinct way of working.
But when you say touch, do you mean the touch of the squeegee? Or
yeah.
Like
the whole way
the
it comes out on the canvas and what he allowed as his production.
Okay.
And that, in fact, and I mean, I'll be happy to talk about this in another couple of years, but and you can see there were things done by assistants that they just don't look right. They just have a different way of the image coming onto the canvas and the way it's put on, and even the way the canvas is handled. And actually, Warhol was much more particular and specific about things than is generally talked about. So.
Well, I'm completely happy about that. I don't mind that at all. But it just shores up the suggestion that there's something about painting.
Yeah, I know there's some questions. I'll bring up one thing. Is I also did a retrospective of Bryce Marden a couple years ago, but I've been interested in Marden's work for a long time. And when I was in San Francisco, the opportunity came up to buy a painting called the Dillon painting, which was from 1966. And in the course of researching the painting, so I discovered that, although it had been not told to me by the dealer, that it had been repainted in 1980, basically by Bryce. And he had done the painting. It had been very badly damaged, but he used the same canvas that already had the work, brought it down, and then just reiterated the process that he had used in 1966. The color probably was slightly different, I think, without question. Close, but not probably exactly the same. But to my mind, and this comes into issues of judgment, this was a better 1966 painting than many, many paintings by Bryce Marden that were still 1966 or 1967 or 1968 paintings that had been reworked by conservators. And it became particularly interesting and evident in the minimalism show at the Minimal Object at MoCA a few years ago, there were 4 paintings from this period brought together. Two of them, and including the Dylan painting, 2 of them had been heavily reworked by conservators, but were still considered originals. And to me, they had none of the feeling or the character of an original. One painting, still owned by Bryce Martin, is probably the only painting that has never been touched, is in absolute pristine condition, and that is the benchmark. But hanging these paintings together then in the retrospective, and tried to include paintings that were more or less in pristine condition. Again, I felt very happy having acquired a 1966 painting, because to me it really was a real Bryce Martin of the period. Carol knows this really well.
I do. I'd like to say something to that, and I'm also going to ask Dana to say something to that, who I think was there at the same time. I remember in the course of this conversation about this painting, Bryce pulling me aside away from, we were taping this, saying, I don't know, I don't know. And I said, about what? And, the way Bryce works in building up these layers, multi-layers, when he looks at the painting, he sees and feels all those layers, and we probably do too, and Gary probably does too. When a restorer goes in, we tend to mix a color and zap it in, and that's not in Bryce's way of looking at these, and maybe in ours, the way that this is perceived. And so I understand what Gary's saying, but I do think Bryce has this particular way of working, but he did rework the painting. I mean, he did. Dana, do you want to comment about this? I don't mean to put you on the spot if you don't.
He did say that painting was, when he first conceived of it, and of course, during that point in his life and what was going on, and Dylan, but then to revisit it, and I think it actually was painted at the apartment.
He did.
Right?
Yeah, not in the studio.
So it wasn't down at the studio. So, the Upper East Side is another thing, from the studio down in NoHo. So, but then there was another painting I'd worked on, and I think he's, all his life, from very early on, he was constantly asked, could you repaint this? Could you repaint this? Could you repaint this? Because of the pristine format. And there was one very particular one, it was one of the moon paintings, and he said, I could no more repaint that painting now, because that occurred to me as I was walking across Houston Street. There was the moon was, and he said, that's a different person, and so he abandoned that. I think that, I don't know how many, these are for the annals of everybody to figure out how many things were reworked, but I really think that it's very difficult to recreate. It's like trying to rewrite a poem or something that you wrote when you were at a certain point in your life.
Okay. Yes, you'd like to speak, and then we'll get there. This man, we haven't heard from this man.
David Harvey. In seeing the session from last night, the lecture from last night, and also today's session, I think one important question is, when does art become an artifact, and who makes that decision at the point where the art is looked at as a document, as something that has relevance, where you want to get into the archaeology of it and make those discoveries, literally get into the DNA of how it's made, what the intention is that's shown in the materials, because that's very much a conservation point of view. And I think that's one of the tensions that is coming up through this session, one of the themes. And also in terms of more conceptual pieces where the idea is important and where the material may not have been a concern, there are all sorts of current and rising technologies where you can make replications. You can do 3D laser scanning, and you could reproduce one of Saul's pieces and achieve that brilliant white sort of color through that process. It may not be steel, it may be a different material. And that way the original piece that was done 20, 30 years earlier could still be preserved as a document. So is there a way of sort of satisfying both camps in terms of that?
Well, that is certainly an approach that certain people make, and certain people don't think it's a very good one for what's left over. So I want to hear what you think about that. In other words, keeping one. This came up earlier this morning too, about keeping the original as an artifact and remaking it because in the eyes of the artist it should be remade. Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
Just real quick. I mean, okay, I've been criticized as over fetishizing objects and being stuck in the graduate school training mode and things like this. But my problem is part of what he's talking about, is that some of these solutions that we've been talking today, they close the door on any other option, and that's what really upsets me. Is that when you talk about repainting a piece, sandblasting and repainting, you can never get back to where you were, and we all have said that perhaps maybe we're stuck in the moment now, and we're in contemporary. We see contemporary art, and what it means to us now may not be what it will mean to people in the future. And why do we want to? I mean, I think this idea of if we're willing to rip the surface off and take re-solder and things like this, why is that? Why is that any more objectionable than just making a whole new piece of steel, putting those things aside, and having something?
Can I answer quickly? Just because of Saul, it's interesting to me that he literally only remade the one piece, as far as we know, because he actually, I think, was interested in the object, and those early objects. No, but and I think this was brought up about the Oberlin piece, that if it would have been fabricated in 1992 instead of 1972. Maybe those open seams would have been perfectly sealed. The technology would have been capable of perfecting execution of that object. But he didn't go for that option. But I would say I do think but so it's a compromise. So it's retaining the original object. Even a lot of the early wood objects have just slight little things. No.
Well, I think that. My problem with your thinking, Rob, is that it's not preserving what the artist did. It has aged. It has changed. It's not the pristine white. It's not what he did. So in keeping the object, you're not keeping an original in what the artist intended, what he's verbalized. So that's kind of an issue. That's
you're reproducing everything but the thing that you don't see or don't.
Yeah, okay. It's okay. Let's move on. Panelists have anything to say?
Sure.
Glenn, do you have something to say? Because I cut you off and I'm feeling bad about that.
Well, I wanted to jump in it a couple times, but at the risk of hijacking the conversation, I didn't want to change the topic. But this conversation has reminded me that I'm now living in a very different world within art and conservation, and specifically the world of installation art and performance art. And so I've been thinking a lot about Paul McCarthy's comments last night and Pip's comments today about the finished work and reperforming art as it's reinstalled over and over again. And so these are the kinds of questions I'm worried about now, not the finished, not the artist's signature, not the paint, but how to perhaps completely remake the piece each time it's installed, or modify it in new ways following artist's instructions. So with a lot of the art that I'm dealing with now, it's understood that the object will be remade or modified. So what many of us are trying to do is capture what is it, sort of the essence of it. So in its variability, as it changes over time, how can we retain that essence of what the artist wanted the public to experience? So it's a whole different set of questions.
Can I just ask, I'm interested in your use of the term remade. Is that the right term?
Why do you think it isn't?
Because I think when we reinstall a work in the gallery, I don't see it the same as remaking it.
Well, I guess I'm
Remaking
thinking
is
of,
something very is to do with physical objects and.
yeah, in this sense, I'm thinking of Janine Antoni, where we maybe, or another artist, where we might cast a new object when it's installed. So starting from scratch with the recipe and the set of instructions. That's what I'm thinking of.
So you're following the
artist's
instructions
instructions
for installing the piece.
for remaking the piece. But you're right. I wouldn't use the term to remake for reinstalling the work. That's a very different.
But it's not. It's not a hard and fast line. And Lynne may have thoughts about this. I've been thinking, particularly about Joseph Beuys, and that's sculpture. But that the idea of touch, placement, the incredible finesse of formal decisions in Beuys was so extraordinary. I did have the incredible good fortune to see the 1979 show at the Guggenheim, which was one of the most profound art experiences I've ever had. I mean, it just was so intensely moving. And then saw the 87 or 88 show in Berlin at the Martin Gropiusbau after Beuys had died. And for me, it was one of the most tragic, sad experiences I've ever had. I felt like looking at a body in an open casket, because it was all, it was like placing things, but without any sense of the feeling, the touch, even if the same object was still extant as an object, the way it was positioned or placed or encountered totally changed the experience of the work. So, and then of course there are those instances where pieces did have elements refabricated, which of course then alters it at yet another level.
Because I think it's partly because when Beuys put things together, even when he started with discrete objects, he installed them in such a way that he created a new mise-en-scène each time, which was responsive to that particular location, the physical qualities, the look of the gallery. And I too saw that retrospective, and then there was a retrospective some years later that Harry Zeman did. And people talked about the Zeman Beuys or the
Bastian Beuys.
The Bastian Beuys, and had different preferences because they were such strong interpretations as they necessarily had to be. But I was reminded too of there was a very exceptional set of circumstances with an Agnes Martin painting from 1974, which had been bought by two people at the time it was first shown in 1975, and had been put in a crate, and they were going to build a house and install the crate. They never did, and this painting sat in a crate for nearly 30 years, and every other Martin from that time has been out in the world, and some have been well looked after and some have had more difficult histories. I saw the painting uncrated and was lucky enough to be able to put it in the context of other paintings from that moment. It looked like a freak. It was so, on the one hand, it was so pristine and beautiful. On the other hand, it didn't have the patina that Carol's talking about, that is somehow what we expect of a work with that age. And it was very hard to come to terms with it relative to the other paintings from that time that had been well looked after. And so I think this whole question about age, and certainly when you get to old master paintings, it's a much bigger issue. Things that look too new from a certain time don't ring true somehow.
Right. Did anyone see the show at the Sackler Museum of the...
Gods in Color?
Yeah, Gods in Color. Do people know about this?
Well, all the Harvard people.
Yeah. Because that, for me, was one of the most startling.
Well, what we should do is explain what this is for people who may not have seen it. This was it was basically a reconstruction of Greek and Roman sculptures, but painting them, and painting them in colors based upon traces that were found in the originals. And people were very careful in analyzing, correct me, Narayan and Jens, if I don't have this right, but very careful in analyzing what those materials were to be able to reproduce them as well as possible in a modern age, and then painting them. So you saw, Cypriot pieces painted, and you saw all these, Greek sculptures painted, and it was quite shocking. But what did you think, Giacomo?
No, I was just saying on that they were painting with plain color, which perhaps
Flat
was
color,
not
yeah.
really what was at that time. But I wanted to make a comment, which is we are probably all at the same page saying that we respect the intellectual property of the artist, that we want to respect their art, etc. But can I have the last slide that there was showing?
I'm sorry, what do you want?
The last slide that we're showing before, if possible. What I saw this morning is that many of these objects are lying on the floor. And the floor sometimes is heavily patterned.
Why? Could you?
I think they need to.
Maybe he went home.
Are
you there? Could you?
Doesn't matter.
All right. You're going to have
the
to.
slide was the white cube.
Yeah.
Imagine that with a white floor. Or imagine that with a black floor.
Right.
There are two completely different things.
Right.
And now, instead, it's presented with a heavy pattern, a long rectangular. Here it is.
Okay.
That, for me, is more disturbing than the idea that it will be a shade of white that is not really exactly the one that was 30 years ago.
Good point.
The same thing for the cube, the 49 3 cubes. There was a heavily patterned, out of phase with the pattern that the piece was trying to make. That's, I just would like to have some.
It's interesting. Saul never, ever brought up the issue of the quality of the floor.
It didn't matter. Other comments from the floor? There's one right there.
Rosa Lowinger. Speaking to the issue that has been raised about installation and performance, etc., and even the idea of installing these pieces that the floor is part of the piece into specific galleries rather than others, it just seems so apparent that the language of theater has to be brought into this. So that, for example, in generations to come, a Paul McCarthy performance or installation will be Paul McCarthy as interpreted by the Walker Arts Center, by the Hammer, etc. And, they will be reviewed as such. This is a good interpretation, this is a mediocre interpretation, this is a fabulous reinterpretation. And by the nature of installation in theater, that is something we just have to accept, that its variability is part of what it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm making a statement, but I'm asking for comments.
No, I think it's what Lynne was talking about in terms of the Beuys installations, that there was a Zeman Beuys or a Bastian Beuys, or, and how did that, for those who had seen Beuys installations that Beuys had done, how different it was. And it's something that I don't know if it's how self-consciously it's really been addressed in our profession. How willing people are to admit. I have to say, one of the most shocking things was Jan Hut did an installation at the museum in Ghent where he put Bob Ryman paintings on a red wall. And if you know anything about Bob Ryman paintings, the wall is just an extension of the idea of the surface of the painting, that it's totally, as he said, paintings don't exist except as they're put up on a wall and inhabit a space. And then it becomes a kind of continuum that extends out a few feet beyond the perimeter of what he has made as an object. And this was just such a radical reinterpretation of Ryman. Of course, I was appalled, but I don't know if Bob saw it or not. Actually, I've never talked to him about it.
Can I just say something really quick to that point about installation? I think that the other point about theatre is that different playwrights exert different degrees of control, and I think that we see that with artists as well, and some artists will very tightly specify exactly the nature of their installation, others will leave a lot more space to interpretation, and I think this role of learning the works is very important. So, I think that we have to recognise that parallel as well with playwrights in terms of control. Absence and presence comes up again and again.
Also, I'd like to bring up Pip's writing about music theory and the idea of thick description in the musical score, that some musicians write music to be interpreted quite with a lot of variability, and others really very tightly specify how that music should be interpreted. So again, I think when we're interviewing artists, talking to artists about curatorial discretion and the variability of installations, it's very important for us to capture that so that future generations of curators, conservators can make decisions based on the artist's conception of their own work and reinstallation of their work.
So are we saying that part of our responsibility as caretakers of art is to history, our responsibility to history is to just simply to document these variations, or to record them, and that's what our responsibility, to allow them to, obviously they're going to occur, they're going to be remade, but our responsibility then is simply to document it.
Who is the we here?
Museum professionals, let's say, historians. Or maybe it's not. What is it that we're to do? What are we to do?
I don't know that we can ever ask enough questions to come up with all the contingencies. When Rachel Harrison last night was talking about, well, they brought out a different design of the cans of soda and she preferred the next one. The museum that hypothetically takes that object on view, how can they ask her enough questions to know in the future that if yet another brand version of this comes out, whether she's going to like it better or not, if they don't happen to have asked her. There are so many things that could happen to a work that I think the idea that we would know enough to be sure that we somehow allowed for all the contingencies just isn't real. And therefore, it gets back, the other end of this same idea might be that there are some people who are good interpreters of a certain artist's work. They have a feel for how to install it, either because even when the artist is alive, but more importantly afterwards. And that's where someone like Zeman seemed to have a way to think within a framework that bore some relationship to what we understood about how Beuys went about doing things, and Bastian, for many people, did not. And they're things that are really not communicable, or not can't easily be tabulated, I think. I would want to say that that's part. So we can't just document for posterity. We've got to allow for a certain tolerance.
Christine Frohnet. I think documentation is extremely important, and sometimes documentation can be conservation, but this brings me back to a question Glenn addressed earlier regarding the Namjoon Pike piece, and I would like to respond to that. You were questioning whether or not the laser equipment can be replaced or migrated to DVD, and I agree with you. As far as my understanding of Namjoon Pike is, he would probably have a very, very high tolerance to have it replaced to DVD, but anyhow, I think as long as you can hold on to the equipment, you should. And I think the laser disc hardware is pretty stable, as well as the laser discs. The early ones have been made from PMMA, and sometimes they warp. But if this is not an issue, it's probably fine. But the question which interests me way more is the question of how do you deal with the monitors? Since we are in the time of that, as we speak, we run out of electron tube monitors, and as far as my aesthetic, and you correct me if I'm wrong, of Namjoon Pike is he would definitely not have tolerated having those replaced by flat screens. And I would love to hear your thoughts and also Pip's thoughts about that.
Which is why we're stockpiling CRT monitors.
How many do you have?
We're all worried about the TV repairman dying out, and
Yes, Jim, I'm sorry.
Different topic. Glenn got to change the topic. I'll change it too. But I want to go back to the repainting question and recognize that, of course, there's going to be uneasiness with a radical step like that. There ought to be, and it ought never to be taken lightly or casually. But I think that Gary pointed out all the nuance that is preserved in that piece. And yes, something was lost, and in the end, everything was gained.
This is in reference to the Oberlin Solowit, yep.
Okay. Yes, there's a woman there and there's a man over here.
I'm thinking about the role of the curator as a collaborator with artists in terms of the presentation of the work and even in terms of decision-making about how to proceed. As a curator, I'm constantly involved in negotiations with artists about the materiality of their work, the durability of it, the length of time that it would be on display, whether it's going to be temporary or permanent. And the curator has, a responsibility to have a conversation, and I think that so far our conversation has been sort of focused on how we can preserve or document or sort of save, in a way, something of the artist's voice. But I feel like as curators and other people involved with artists in those decisions, that we are in fact imposing our perspectives, our ideologies and philosophies onto, into the conversation at the very least. And I think that we need to recognize our own responsibility as active agents in this process, rather than just thinking of ourselves as sort of interpreters or sort of passive kind of recorders of history.
Oh, wait. Is there someone over there? Who's got the mics? Jim, up there? If you're holding it and you'd like to say something, please do.
Well, I did actually. Going back to Glenn's and his Andrew Pake, we actually have an Andrew Pake called Who's Your Tree? And we had to migrate from Laserdisc to a DVD. We were lucky he was still living, and we actually have a document stating by him what we can preserve, what should be preserved, and what we can migrate. And in terms of the monitors, he said they have to look the same.
I'm sorry, couldn't hear that.
Could you hold it closer?
So, well...
The last state, just the last state.
So in terms of the monitors, they have to stay the same. They have to look the way they do in this basic sculptural tree.
Mm-hmm. But the playback equipment, he agreed to
Migrate.
show, to use DVD players.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to think a little bit larger as well, not with just today's technology, but do we set in motion the process of changing new playback equipment as new technologies develop? So do we freeze the look of the CRT monitors, and do we not freeze the look of the playback equipment?
That, I think, is definitely judgmental in terms of he liked the appearance. The appearance should stay the same. So that was where we were coming from. In terms of the DVDs, ours are hidden, so that's a little caveat. And I would have to reread the document again to give a more precise answer.
But again, this is artist to artist. I mean, some artists, the quality of the image and the kind of equipment that is interpreting that image is actually really fundamental, and others that image quality is not so important. And it's just, you can't, I think, what we can do is, like, this issue of documentation is to try to understand as best as possible the artist's intention, to try to understand as best as possible, why they made decisions they made, and to realize that every one of them is different. And that's also in the presentation of the work. Some artists have, very specific ideas about what height a painting should be shown on, or what kind of a floor a sculpture should be on, and others really don't care.
But it's very complicated because, as Rachel said last night, you change your mind. All of us have interviewed artists, and what you're hearing is what the artist thinks about that piece at that day. And the best we can do, and I think this is something we really can do, is through a series of interviews, you get a sense of the thinking. Because I think that's what you're alluding to, that after the artist is gone, that's what we rely on. I think we have time for two more. We've really gone over, and you've been very patient. Denise, and Jim's had his hand up back there. Right there. Green shirt.
Well, you already have said it. I wanted to reiterate that I do feel that an object should, Jim Bernstein, should reflect the time of its creation. And when we get away from that, we lose more and more information. intent. So I think, yes, it's the artist's intent, but not interpretation of intent 40 years later with changes in philosophy and technology, but at the time of creation. The Namjoon Paik, if it started with a videotape, I'd rather see a videotape player there to reflect the technology of when that piece was done, and then hide your other machines. The retrospective of the LeWitt is a perfect example. We learned so much from retrospectives. I mean, here we are, we work with objects, we see them the day they leave the artist's studio or the fabricator's studio, and then they undergo shift. And when you put them together in a retrospective, you see works, the materials are changing, the technology, the technique is evolving, plus they've aged differently depending on what conditions they've been exposed to, philosophy of certain cultures or collections. And when we can see that side by side, there's a lot to be learned. And that gallery is a great example, because here you have all these pieces with a certain patina, and then you have the one reworked piece. And it's sort of like, well, I'm seeing a dog and a tail. And personally, I would hate to see them all repainted pristine. Well, first of all, what is pristine white? You know, I think we could put up 100 chips. And the white that he used initially, or the proprietary product, probably was very white. But the oil enamel or the lacquer has aged. And perhaps he was going for a warmer white, because, you know, when you put a white over a metal, a dark metal, you get a very cold bluing effect. So it's very complex, and but I like to be able to get back to the object and not be in a rush to repaint.
Denise?
This is Denise Domergue. I'm sort of the faction that sort of gives to the artist the artist's intent. I weight things towards the artist's intent, but I think that now we are at a period where we can start to target the artists that are going to give us problems in the future. It's pretty, you know, they're already giving us problems. So we can, you know, make sure that we get their last word on things and ask them all the questions we need while they're alive, because afterwards then, you know, it just might just have to recede into artifact. But as long as we can, you know, I think we all know who is problematical and who presents the most fragile work and the most, you know, difficult solutions, and we can go to those people, and I agree that we should just talk, curators and conservators should gang up on these people and get as much information out of them now as we can.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We've run over. I appreciate your staying. Unless there's any particular final insight, and there is one, then we'll go.
With my soapbox here, I just want to make one little plug. The conversation that we've been having reminds me that we all have information from artist interviews in our files that we carry with us in one way or another. And there is now a place where we can contribute to, with our unpublished information. This is the Inca Artists Archives database that was set up in order to continue a virtual conversation like this, to be able to go and see access documents in other people's files across the world, artist transcripts and so on. So if any of you are interested in this, I encourage you to learn more about the Inca database.
Okay, tomorrow morning we start at 9. We will be addressing specifically the facsimile or replica of a work of art, the original work of art aged, and then the original work of art repainted by the artist. So you have lots to think about tonight. We'll see you all tomorrow.